Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is Monday, March 3rd, 2025, and it's episode 325, and we're going to talk about trade, not war. So, in the news over the weekend, or apparently a few days ago, Russia offered the United States a deal for rare earth materials, which is supposedly the reason why Zelensky came to the United States to sign a deal for rare earth materials in the Ukraine. But of course, those rare earth materials are in Russia-occupied territory. So what they were actually going to sign, who knows? But like I said, and I think in the previous episode, it seemed like it was actually a setup for the American people and the Russians to be able to see that Trump is actually moving towards peace and just how much of a nut job cokehead Zelensky is. All right, so in order to kind of understand, take another look at this whole Russia Ukraine conflict, I thought it would be kind of interesting to go back to 2014, the Ukraine crisis there. And there's been a lot of material that has come out. I know Scott Horton came out with a book, Provoked, which is a massive tome, but it's supposed to talk about a lot of the conflict that the United States foments or brings about because of their foreign policies. So I have two different articles here that I'm going to read snippets from, and from two different perspectives, perhaps. I'm going to read quickly because you can look them up yourself and find them if you wanted to. Okay, but I'll try to read as much as I can quickly. So the first article is from Vox, VOX, and the title is Everything You Need to Know About the 2014 Ukraine Crisis. And this is by Max Fisher, September 3rd, 2014. Okay, so it's a little bit later than the other article I'm going to, several months later. So this is how it goes. Ukraine is a Texas-sized country wedged between Russia and Europe. It was part of the Soviet Union until 1991, and since then has been a less than perfect democracy with a very weak economy and a foreign policy that wavers between pro-Russian and pro-European. This all began as an internal Ukrainian crisis in November 2013 when President Viktor Yanukovych rejected a deal for greater integration with the European Union, sparking mass protests, which Yanukovych attempted to put down violently. Russia backed Yanukovych in the crisis while the US and Europe supported the protesters. Okay, so you got the protest is because Yanukovych rejected the European deal in favor of the Russian deal. And so obviously the US is backing the protesters and Russia is backing the government, Yanukovych, the democratically elected government. And let's go on. Since then, several big things have happened. In February, anti-government protests toppled the government and ran Yanukovych out of the country. Russia, trying to salvage its lost influence in Ukraine, invaded and annexed Crimea the next month. In April, pro-Russia separatist rebels began seizing territory in eastern Ukraine. The rebels shot down Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 on July 17th, killing 298 people, probably accidentally. Fighting between the rebels and the Ukrainian military intensified. The rebels started losing, and in August, the Russian army overtly invaded eastern Ukraine to support the rebels. This sounds very familiar. This has all brought the relationship between Russia and the West to its lowest point since the Cold War. Sanctions are pushing the Russian economy to the brink of recession, and more than 2,500 Ukrainians have been killed. A lot of this comes down to Ukraine's centuries-long history of Russian domination. The country has been divided more or less evenly between Ukrainians who see Ukraine as a part of Europe and those who see it as intrinsically linked to Russia. An internal political crisis over the disagreement may have been inevitable. Meanwhile, in Russia, Putin is pushing an imperial revival nationalist worldview that sees Ukraine as part of Greater Russia and as the victim of ever encroaching Western hostility. So you can kind of see the typical uh, Russia's bad, Putin is evil, they want to dominate the world. He has aspirations to bring back the old communist Soviet Union. And it's surprising to see that Crimea was invaded and the eastern parts of Ukraine were also invaded by Russian forces in 2014, right? So at some point they must have withdrawn and then, or they were there. And then hostilities started again in 2022. Now, the next article I want to take a look at is from the Mises Wire. So, Vox is your typical liberal, uh, at the time news source, and Mises Wire, of course, is anarcho-capitalist. And so the title is U.S. Foreign Interventions Help Putin. And this is Judge Andrew Napolitano, March 10th, 2014. So here's some, it's a short article. Mises Wire generally tends to be very short. And in Ukraine in 2004, the Bush administration fomented the so-called Orange Revolution. This too was done by our diplomats and intelligence community, whose agents agitated demonstrators in the streets and liberally distributed American dollars to them. This resulted in a free election, which resulted in subsequent free elections, until the most recent of those produced a president who, as an ex-communist, was drawn to Russia than to US or Europe. And so a couple of important things to point out. Um, the Bush administration, 10 years before Yanukovych was kicked out, right? They fomented the Orange Revolution to bring about so-called free elections. Now, these free elections eventually led to the election of Yanukovych, okay, who wanted to become closer with Russia. In other words, the idea of having the Orange Revolution is to have a government that's friendly to the West, to America and Europe. And fast forward 10 years into the future, and you have a government that was democratically elected, but favors Russia instead. I remember talking about this in 2014, that what was going on was that Russia had offered a better deal, right? So here it goes. When the Ukraine government needed cash and Russia uh, offered Ukraine a better deal than the European Union, our imperial diplomats and lawless intelligence gurus were embarrassed. So the U.S. fomented another revolution in the streets of Kiev. One of our diplomats, Victoria Newland, acknowledged as much in a tapped and taped, complete with expletives, and eventually viral cell phone conversation. Then Viktor Yanukovych, the popularly and lawfully elected Ukrainian president, was toppled and fled to Moscow. The new unelected Ukraine president has received American recognition and help. Earlier this week, the U.S. offered him $1 billion in immediate cash. Enter Vladimir Putin. He is the popularly elected president of Russia who has designs on reconstituting the old Soviet Union, so he's repeating that as well. Putin is also an ex-KGB agent. He is a torturer, a murderer, a tyrant, and a monster. This is Judge Napolitano, okay, and which is interesting because if you listen to his recordings on Judging Freedom, he's a little bit uh, perhaps a little bit more aware of what's going on, and maybe his tone has changed just a little bit. So Putin is also an ex-KGB agent. He is a torturer. Wait, did I read that already? Or is it repeating again? Anyway, torturer, murderer, tyrant, monster. He often lamented the demise of the former Soviet Union. Ukraine was a part of that union until the evil empire dissolved in 1991. It was the most economically productive part of that union, Ukraine was. Today, it enjoys a mostly free market and is highly entrepreneurial, though partly a welfare state. Roughly two-thirds of Ukraine identifies with Europe and one-third with Russia. After Yanukovych showed up at Putin's doorstep in Moscow, Putin flexed his muscles by sending 16,000 Russian troops in uniforms without insignias and wearing black masks over the border to occupy Crimea, a province of Ukraine, which has been part of Russia and the Soviet Union until 1954, right? So even then, he acknowledges that Crimea was originally part of Russia, but once the Soviet Union collapsed, they gave Crimea, the control of Crimea, to the Ukraine because everyone was touchy-feely, feel good back in those days, right? I continue. The US and Europe are in no position to resist Russian invasion, nor should they. Europe receives roughly 30% of its oil, natural gas, and coal from Russia. If the U.S. tightens the economic screws on Russia, American banks will suffer, and the Russian oligarchs and Russian people will suffer. But no group will suffer as much as Europeans who have grown dependent on Russian fuel. And Putin is unmoved by personal embarrassment or human suffering. Okay, and so the judge goes on to defend Putin and Russia by asking, if the shoe was on America's foot, right? If a foreign country started putting troops in Mexico and Canada, what would we do, right? And he adds that, Ukraine is so far away. What does this have to do with us anyway? NBC News, the title of the article says Russia offered U.S. a deal for minerals in Ukrainian territory it seized. Russian officials proposed an agreement for the U.S. to make money off critical minerals and metals under Moscow's control. This is February 25th, 2025, by Courtney Kube, Carol Lee, and Dan DeLuce. Okay, so basically, you have all this hostility against Putin and Russia in 2004, 2014, and then fast forward to today, 2025, Russia is offering a deal for the minerals, rare earth stuff that's in Ukrainian territory. Okay. They control those areas in Ukraine which have the rare earth materials. We have to also note that the tensions between Ukraine and Russia go back many hundreds of years. More recently, there was a lot of famine in the Ukraine, during the communist era because the communists took all of the food to feed the rest of Russia. And so a lot of people starved to death in the Ukraine, and that certainly doesn't make things better. So there's a lot of tension between Russia and Ukraine. We know that, uh, there were a lot of Ukrainians which sided with Hitler and the Nazis in World War II and fought against Russians or the Soviets. One we talked about a while ago. Ooh, I didn't write down the episode number, but Hunke, Hunke, is in the title. I believe it's like 200 episode. Yeah, 205, episode 205. I talked about Yaroslav Hunka, who was a World War II veteran from the Ukraine living in Canada. And, he was celebrated. They gave him standing ovations in the Canadian Parliament when Zelensky came by visiting, I believe it was 2 years ago. But Hunka is a Nazi, okay? And that was the weird thing. When I first heard it, I was like, wait, he's a Ukrainian who fought against the Russians in World War II. Well, that would make him a Nazi, right? Because the people fighting the Soviets in World War II was Hitler. And so to fight against Russia would make you aligned with Hitler. and the Nazis, right? And they gave him standing ovations, So I thought that was weirdly ironic that they were celebrating a Nazi in the Canadian Parliament, but it's par for the course, right? So I was talking to someone who knows a lot he spends a lot of time in Europe, and so he saw a lot of people fleeing Ukraine. And I mentioned the Nazis, and he says, yes, they have a Nazi problem. What? And you're supporting it. That's what's so insane about the support for Ukraine. People know they're Nazis, which means that they know they're supporting Nazis. I'm just dumbfounded by their logic, right? But Putin is worse, just, I don't know. I just have to laugh. And if they were in front of me, I would laugh in their face. I'd be like, you guys are supporting, you knowingly are supporting Nazis. And at the same time, then calling Trump a Nazi, right? Because he wants to end the war in Ukraine. You can't make this stuff up, right? So, in other words, all of this bloodshed, right? A million dead, some people say, in Ukraine, a million dead Ukrainians, and adding to that number every day. Um, all of this could have been avoided, right? So it never was about Ukraine. Oh, those evil Russians invading Ukraine. It never was about that, but it was about the US control, US companies in control, or the European Union in control, whatever. And so it's about control and who gets to make all the money, right? Who gets to say, I own those rare earth fields in the Ukraine, whatever. Um, but now, what has been wrought, right? What has been accomplished, achieved, death, destruction. And we're right back where we started, right? So Russia is in control, excuse me, of a lot of territory in the Ukraine, which is what the United States did not want, right? They're in control. Now they're trying to make deals with the United States. They could have done this years ago. They could have done this in 2004. But no, no, had to do it this way so that the insiders in Washington, D.C., they get to own and divide up as they want, right? And all these people die. All this waste of energy, all this waste of life, all this waste of money. Right? I looked it up. It was we sent Ukraine probably most recently $180 billion. For what? For what? It was such a waste, right? And so I always talked about in my classes that there's so much corruption everywhere. Like we are in part responsible by voting for these characters, right? Voting for the things that they say when in reality, when we're not looking or listening, they conduct all of these shenanigans all over the world. I mean, 2004, who was thinking about Ukraine in 2004, unless you were actually living there, right? And so the corruption is rampant all throughout government. Everyone kind of acknowledges it and then shrugs their shoulders and says, but I'm voting next time. It's probably the reason why, the corruption being everywhere in every agency, every which way, it's probably why there is so much news about attempted cuts and audits by Doge, right? But they got to pick it up, okay? There's just too much waste that needs to be cut out before everything goes sideways here in the United States, right? Even talking about this is a waste of time, right? We could be talking about innovation, creative ideas, sharing our creative ideas, like praising each other for how they came up with these crazy ideas. That was what was so exciting about teaching in a university is that once you get people to understand how to be creative, right? Where to find that creative juice in your life and in your head. Man, it is so cool to see people empowered, not because of the color of their skin, not because of their major, not because of their job or what position they have in government, but because they themselves, looking at their problem, understanding their problem, whatever it is, and then finding solutions for it, right? As opposed to hearing some government voice telling them what the problem is, climate change, food insecurity, whatever, you know, instead of being fed these problems, which really most of us never struggle with, right? But rather look at what our problem is. How can we make our lives better? What do I need to do to make that happen? And so instead of, pretending to solve all these global problems that politicians fed you, no, you're making your own life better by finding solutions for the problems that you are encountering. Episode 262, I talked about Syria versus free trade. Episode 254, I talked about the Minoans, how they traded to create wealth, right? So right now we have war, 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 right? Which means no trade. There's no trade. Look, you know, Biden administration didn't talk to the Russians for 3 years at least, right? They only wanted war, which of course is extremely expensive. It's destructive. You don't produce anything, just a lot of people die, right? We want trade. Trade means no war. Trade means fostering wealth, right? And it's interesting if you've ever met anyone from the Ukraine. I had a student whose mom took her to the 2014 uprisings, right? And she said right there, she was like 14 years old, maybe, and she was in there feeding sandwiches to the people who were pro-Europe, right? And so wow, she really hated Russians. And I think I might have told you this before, but in class when she was going off on Russians, she didn't realize, but the girl sitting next to her was a Russian. And it just, that kind of blind hatred, you never know where it takes you and, what you would say that you later regret. I don't think maybe she regrets now. I hope she does, but who knows? She bore scars and only had thoughts of revenge, and I was, it was pretty sad. But that's what you do in war. You demonize the enemy, the opponent, right? This person is absolutely evil. Is Putin good or bad? I mean, I don't care, right? America and American presidents have done horrible things. Bush, the Gulf Wars, Obama with the drone strikes. Come on. And right now, Israel is cutting off water and food to Gaza again, and Trump doesn't say anything about it. By the Biden administration, by sending all that money to Ukraine, they're kidnapping boys off the street. They're kidnapping old men off the street, poor men, right? Because all the rich ones bought off the kidnappers, right? They call them press gangs, right? They press them into service, right? But they have no training when they show up on the battlefront, right? Just some new clothes, and then uh, they quickly die. It's terrible. So while some people get rich, the rest of us become poor. Military industrial complex insiders, they get rich. Politicians get rich from kickbacks and other insider information dealings. And the rest of us, because of inflation and because of this constant war, we become poorer and we have to suffer. We have to keep making people aware, right? We have to come up with strategies to get them to see what's really going on. When I finally discovered the free market in 2005, I managed eventually to get my dad to see differently, the world differently before he died, right? Like once I talked about decriminalizing marijuana, and he's like close to 90 years old. He just looked at me. He says, "Are you smoking marijuana?" And it was a big argument. And I'm like, "No, I'm not smoking dope," And so my family, my church. I was able to eventually get them to see and understand the beauty of freedom. It doesn't happen overnight. Even my church, when I started preaching, pro-freedom ideas, it was a little weird for them. They just could not understand. But now it's been what, 20 years? Wow, it's been 20 years of me preaching this way. They get it now, right? Or at least most of them do anyway, that freedom is the way, right? Each of us following and researching and digging, trying to understand each individual, our lives get better and we can contribute not only to their families, but to the congregation and also to society, this more of a pro-freedom understanding of society. When I got married, I wasn't like this. I was probably more of a liberal because of my education. And so, but I brought my wife along, right? Every time I learned something new, I came home, I shared it with my wife, and now she is anarcho-capitalist just like me, and my kids are all ANCAPs as well. It's that constant dialogue, teaching and growing together, which helps us to foster these ideas of freedom, spread the ideas of freedom. You know your family, you know your friends better than anyone else. You know what strategy you can use or what you should use, right? Because every conversation happens the same way. So you pre-plan your conversation. You say things to try to get them to question, to doubt the, official narrative, and so that they can start asking questions to you. And so you answer the questions. You say, see, this is what I'm talking about. This is the way for a better, peaceful future. Trade, not war, right? And that's it for this episode. I will talk to you all next time.